2023 has been a banger of a year with incredible games releasing every single month. It's been difficult to keep up with every game, which begs the question, is this the best year in gaming? Let's take a look back at some of the best years we've seen and compare. People my age tend to point to 1998 as one of the greatest years in gaming for good reason. What is still considered one of the best games of all time released in November of that year. 2 years after Nintendo revolutionized 3D games with Mario 64, they did it again with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, popularizing features such as the target lock system and context-based button prompts. It influenced countless games after it, with Hidetaka Miyazaki stating that Ocarina of Time became a textbook for 3D action games. Like looking at a casting couch under a blacklight, its DNA can be found everywhere, from the Soul series to Okami to Grand Theft Auto, The Witcher, and Shadow of the Colossus. Its age shows now, but it still stands the test of time and remains the favorite for many Zelda fans 25 years later. And just 2 days prior to Ocarina's release was the launch of another very influential game and one of the best debut games for any studio ever. Valve released Half-Life on the PC November of 1998 and aimed to create a more immersive first-person shooter that was more than just mowing down enemy after enemy. Due to time restraints, no cutscenes were included in the game, instead telling the story through scripted sequences. While this came about by accident, it wound up being a feature praised by everyone, as the player remains in control of Gordon Freeman the entire time. In 1998, first-person shooters were action games first and foremost. So when Half-Life arrived on the scene with a fascinating sci-fi plot inside an immersive world that didn't include conventional levels, it set the bar really high for first-person shooters that came after it. The crazy thing is that both of those games were released in November that year, but we also saw 4 sequels to popular franchises that month, with Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, and Twisted Metal getting their third entries and Oddworld getting its second. November was definitely the strongest month, but nearly every month saw a major release as well. The year started off very strong, with both Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy Tactics releasing a week apart in January. Resident Evil 2 came first and received a ton of critical acclaim. It broke sales records at the time, surpassing major games like Super Mario 64 and Final Fantasy VII. It improved upon just about everything the first game accomplished and became the survival horror game. Its success ensured Capcom would prioritize the series, which is thankfully still going strong today. March was another strong month that is mostly carried by StarCraft. To this day, it's still one of the best real-time strategy games ever made. It remained one of the most popular online games for years afterwards, and is largely responsible for establishing the pro gaming scene in South Korea. I myself put countless hours into StarCraft, and to this day, my life for hire echoes in my mind. Outside of Blizzard's classic, we also saw a shift in the Need for Speed series as they released the third game in the franchise and added police pursuits as a main mechanic. We also got Yoshi's Story on the N64, and while it wasn't the most well received due to being overly simplistic, it's an adorable game that's clearly aimed at a younger audience. Moving on to April was the console release of Tekken 3, which is still considered the best game of the franchise by many. It went on to become the 5th highest selling PlayStation game and is ranked as one of the greatest fighting games ever made. That same month, we got 1080 Snowboarding on the N64, which was easily the best snowboarding game until SSX came along a couple years later. In May, 3 very different games were released, with Panzer Dragoon Saga being the first of the bunch. In an attempt to compete with Final Fantasy, Sega wanted to shift Panzer Dragoon from rail shooters into an RPG. It was incredibly well received and one of the best games on the Sega Saturn. On the opposite spectrum came Gran Turismo. It's the highest selling game on the PlayStation by a good margin by being the most realistic racing simulator on consoles. Just a few days later, we saw the emergence of another big franchise with Unreal. While the franchise saw a lot of success, its lasting legacy comes from the engine Epic used. Unreal Engine can be seen all across the gaming landscape and gave developers the tools necessary to create some of the best games ever made. June was a relatively slow month, but in 1998, that means we only saw one great game with the release of Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo took the foundation Super Mario 64 laid down and surpassed it in just about every way. It looked great at the time, had charm oozing out of its furry little ass, incredibly fun platforming and collectible hunting, amazing music, and memorable protagonists. One of my favorite platformers ever, Banjo-Kazooie will always have a special place in my heart. A couple months later in August, another couple franchises were birthed. The very first Tom Clancy game came out, and Rainbow Six was a much different shooter than the likes of Quake and similar titles. Focusing on planning and strategy, Rainbow Six is the first major success in the tactical shooter genre. At the end of the month, the release of Tenchu Stealth Assassins began a trio of stealth games in '98 that would push the genre forward. Thief the Dark Project came in December, and its utilization of light and sound as core game mechanics was revolutionary. It offered unparalleled freedom at the time that made exploring and replaying levels to find new ways to complete them an absolute blast. But one game released in September of '98 and can be credited with really popularizing the genre. Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid came out and blew the tits off everyone. Its blend of stealth action gameplay and intriguing and cinematic story was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. I'm still amazed by the Psycho Mantis fight. Hearing him call out my taste in games as he reads my memory card and figuring out the only way to beat him is to switch controller ports was fucking mind-blowing. Despite that, Metal Gear Solid wasn't even the most popular game that month. This little franchise known as Pokemon came along and murdered the wallets of parents around the world. I didn't own a Game Boy until Pokemon came along, and then suddenly my brother and I each had one along with our own copies of Red and Blue. If I were to rank the games in my life that meant the most to me, Pokemon Red would easily be up there. I played the hell out of it and took catching them all very seriously. Red and Blue paved the way for Pokemon, which eventually went on to become the highest grossing media franchise of all time. September was a strong month in '98 because we also saw NFL Blitz come out, which is still an all-time favorite American football game. Exaggerating the violence of an already violent sport was a psychopathic recipe for success, and man was it a hell of a lot of fun. We also got Squaresoft's first M-rated game in Parasite Eve, which is a horror RPG with Resident Evil gameplay elements. But the last major game of September was another favorite of mine, Spyro the Dragon, baby! I fucking love these games, and this was actually the first game I played on the PlayStation. Earlier, I mentioned Banjo-Kazooie as one of my favorite platformers ever, but that's after the Spyro games. They aren't difficult whatsoever, but the worlds, characters, and that incredibly memorable music all combine to make this game so good. The last half of 1998 was just plain ridiculous. We also saw the release of F-Zero X on the N64 for all those who wanted to race at breakneck speeds. Xenogears dropped in North America in October to widespread critical acclaim, with many publications announcing it as the best RPG of the year. Then right before Halloween, we got a 1-2 punch with the release of Fallout 2 and Grim Fandango. Then in December, Baldur's Gate came out and shot BioWare into the public eye. To those not playing that game, there were children barrel rolling and shooting down TIE fighters in Star Wars Rogue Squadron. In a year with some really great first-person shooters, Turok 2 put an exclamation point on a fantastic year for the genre upon its release. In an era where Jurassic Park was fresh in people's minds, an FPS that featured dinosaurs as enemies was an awesome experience. To round everything out, we got a re-release of a classic Zelda title with Link's Awakening on the brand new Game Boy Color that released in October the same year. I listed off some great games with genre-defining titles that push gaming forward, but is 1998 really the best year? We only have to jump forward 3 years to find another contender. 2001 delivered a higher volume of fantastic games as developers created games for newer and more powerful systems. With the PS2 having released the year prior and both the Xbox and GameCube dropping in November, we saw a massive jump forward in what games could do. January starts off with a single title that was the first to hit 1 million units sold on the PS2. Capcom's Onimusha borrowed quite a bit from its Resident survival horror cousin, but repackaged that into more of an action game. In fact, a bug discovered in Onimusha led to a full upheaval of the combat for another Capcom title that came out in August. The release of Devil May Cry gave Capcom another hit franchise, this time giving players a challenging combo-based hack and slash that provided the blueprint for games like God of War. What came out the following month was originally intended to be a sequel to Super Mario RPG, but wound up taking on its own identity with a timeless art style. Paper Mario dropped towards the end of the N64's life cycle, combining RPG elements with Mario's familiar concepts, which made it one of the most beloved titles on the N64. March, on the other hand, provided 3 games for very different audiences: Zone of the Enders, Black and White, and the controversial Conker's Bad Fur Day. Rare unleashed the cutesy-looking game that was anything but that. Conker made unsuspecting parents pissed when they bought the adorable squirrel game for little Timmy, only to find out he's drinking and cursing and fighting a giant pile of shit. It's hilarious and a genuinely fun game from start to finish.
I am the great mighty Pooh.
Spring transitioning into summer is when things really began to pick up. May delivered The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Ages for the Game Boy Color, and Crazy Taxi 2 for the Sega Dreamcast. But one of the most underrated series out there got its start towards the end of May. Red Faction hit PC and the PS2, sporting unprecedented levels of environmental destruction. Then summer arrives, and what is usually a dry period for games was anything but that. June saw the release of an expansion pack for the second Baldur's Gate game, adding even more content to an already dense game. The Dreamcast got Sonic Adventure 2 featuring series mainstay Shadow for the first time. This sadly wound up being the final Sonic game created for a Sega console, and damn was it a great way to go out. Finally, Twisted Metal made the leap to PS2 with a dark entry that included a storyline for each individual character that was actually incredibly interesting. The series just never hit the same afterwards. Then July smacked us with two amazing games. The first being Gran Turismo 3, which at the time was widely considered the greatest racing game ever made. Alongside that came Max Payne from Remedy Entertainment. What we got is a John Woo-inspired third-person shooter that utilized the bullet time mechanic popularized by The Matrix. Slow-mo diving while mowing down bad guys while Max Payne's face is contorted in a constant look of pure constipation is so unbelievably fun. On top of that is the noir graphic novel style of storytelling and one of the most haunting levels I have ever played. Then the latter half of 2001 shows up and it is fucking goated, my friends. September is the calmest month with the release of Advance Wars on the brand spanking new Game Boy Advance that dropped in June earlier in the year. Its approach to the turn-based strategy genre made it easier for filthy casuals to get into. Its success is largely responsible for Nintendo making the decision to finally bring over the Fire Emblem franchise to the West. We also got this beautiful little game called Eco that didn't sell all that well but was universally acclaimed by critics. But the ultimate game released in September was the much-awaited sequel to Konami's Silent Hill. Silent Hill 2 wasn't as well received upon release as it is now, especially in Japan. People expected a sequel to answer the questions that arose in the first game, and instead we got a whole new set of characters that are disconnected from anything the first game established, aside from the town of Silent Hill. Despite that initial disappointment, Silent Hill 2 is one of, if not the greatest survival horror games ever made. Its movement and combat are clunky, but everything else about it is perfect. The enemies are terrifying and memorable, the town is fleshed out and provides even more intrigue, but what really shines is the plot. James Sunderland and company find themselves in a nightmare of their own doing, and the result is one of the best storylines ever told in horror. If that wasn't enough, October treats us with Soul Reaver 2, AVP 2, Civilization 3, and of course Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. Unfortunately for those games, they all released after the absolute juggernaut that came out on October 22nd, 2001. Grand Theft Auto 3 busted onto the scene and changed the landscape of gaming forever. It was easily the best-selling game that year and marked a shift in how developers approach their games. We saw way more open worlds after the success of GTA 3. But somehow, GTA 3 wasn't the peak of gaming that year. It certainly changed things and was an absolute blast to play, but November was an incredible month that saw the launch of the Xbox and GameCube alongside a set of awesome games. Starting with the GameCube, the standouts were definitely Super Monkey Ball, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, and Luigi's Mansion, which was so much different than any other Nintendo game released up to that point. On the Xbox side of things, it had its own party game in Fusion Frenzy, a fantastic racer with Project Gotham Racing, another entry into the Oddworld series, the third iteration of the Dead or Alive games, and obviously the biggest game and one of the best launch titles ever is Halo Combat Evolved. It showed that first-person shooters can work incredibly well on consoles, and ensured that Xbox remained a major player in the console space for years afterwards. For me personally, it was my introduction to the FPS genre. I only ever watched people play Doom or Quake, and never bothered to play one for myself until Halo came along, and I played through the campaign solo and co-op on every difficulty setting. Its local versus mode was a blast, despite the constant bickering between everyone for screen checking. Halo was and still is an amazing game that changed first-person shooters forever. Outside of the launch titles previously mentioned, we also got a couple awesome snowboarding games, Amped on the Xbox and SSX Tricky. The Game Boy Advance got the first release of the fantastic Golden Sun games, and the PC got Return to Castle Wolfenstein. But despite those major games coming out, there's another colossal release that came out just a few days prior to the launch of the new consoles. Sony knew they needed to drop something big before Nintendo and Microsoft could eat into their market share, and they fucking crushed it with Metal Gear Solid 2. People were hyped to play a Solid Snake again. Then the intro ended and were suddenly thrust into the shoes of Raiden. That was a disappointment to some, but Raiden proved himself to be a worthy protagonist, and the gameplay and storyline are what shined brightest. Metal Gear Solid 2 helped Hideo Kojima cement himself as one of the top video game directors around. But the year still isn't done. Naughty Dog produced their first outing since moving on from Crash Bandicoot by giving Sony yet another mascot-worthy franchise in Jak and Daxter. Final Fantasy X moved the series forward with characters that portrayed realistic emotions. However, the GameCube won December with another major franchise in Pikmin and the sequel to their Smash N64 hit, Super Smash Bros. Melee. This is the game that made me get a GameCube. It has by far the most hours on that console for me personally, and an amazing blend of chaotic fighting and unique styles amongst its characters has made the series one of the most widely played games in esports. Melee is still played today in tournaments across the world because it's just that good.
Oh shit, here we go again.
This was arguably the best era for gaming because another 3 years later, 2004 fucked our wallets with a plethora of games we didn't deserve. January was a slow month, so when we jump into February, we're given a remake of the first Metroid game for the Game Boy Advance. Metroid Zero Mission brought a classic game to modern audiences with upgrades to make it even more approachable. The first couple months of the year were slow, but March more than made up for that with 7 games well worth your time. The first of the bunch was a game on the Xbox that stood up well to PS2 classics God of War and Devil May Cry. Ninja Gaiden was a must-own for any Xbox player because of its fast-paced and challenging combat. Nearly a week later, what I consider the most underrated horror game ever released came out. The Suffering follows a prisoner on death row that fights his way through a prison full of monsters. Despite selling over 1 million copies, it seems like no one ever talks about this game, which is a damn shame. Just a day after that came a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, released on the GameCube. Twin Snakes sported improved visuals and implemented updated gameplay mechanics used in Metal Gear Solid 2, as well as some additional cutscenes. After that, Unreal Tournament 2004 came out and was the first great shooter in a year that will end up being an all-timer for the genre. It was the first in the series to include vehicles and larger scale battles. It's a fast-paced game that shines in multiplayer. Another week later was the sequel to Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Pandora Tomorrow used the same formula from the first game, which was a great thing, but most notably, it introduced a really unique multiplayer component called Spies vs. Mercenaries. It was a 2v2 game with one half taking on the spy role, which plays similarly to Sam Fisher and the other half playing as mercenaries in a first-person view. The result was incredibly fun, tense, and often hilarious matches. Alongside the release of Pandora Tomorrow was another Ubisoft title. The first Far Cry tossed players into an open-world island jungle that gave us the freedom to approach objectives in various ways. It kicked off a long-running series that continues to see a lot of success. Finally, right before the month is over, we're treated to Resident Evil Outbreak, a spin-off that featured local and online co-op play for the first time in the series. Progressing through the year, April saw the release of the third Onimusha game, which wound up being the best one in the series. Despite improving the controls and combat, the game still utilized fixed camera angles, which actually inspired the change in camera angle in Resident Evil 4. Shinji Mikami thought Onimusha 3 could have been way better if they went over the shoulder with it, and that wound up contributing to the direction Resident Evil 4 took. April also gave us our first great fighting game of the year, and the first entry in the Fight Night franchise. The implementation of the total punch control mechanic allowed players even more control of their fighters' punches using both analog sticks. Nearly halfway through the year, and May provides another couple games. Red Dead Revolver was something different for Rockstar, especially in a post-GTA world. It was a linear western shooter that was pretty damn fun. Of Of course, its most notable accomplishment is it set Rockstar up for the eventual release of the Red Dead Redemption series. On a much darker note, the third Thief game dropped on PC and Xbox at the end of May. It played similar to the previous entries in a fantasy world that also includes one of the scariest levels in a non-horror game. Robbing the cradle was something else, and it's a damn shame the game didn't sell very well, leading to the series going dormant for 10 years. Then summer hits and we get two great games based off movies. Spider-Man 2 was the first to really nail the web-slinging aspect of the famed superhero. 15-year-old me had a blast swinging through New York and ignoring every crying child wailing about their balloon. Fuck your balloon! The second game based on the movie was a surprise hit. Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay served as a prequel to Pitch Black. It combined elements of first-person shooters and stealth games to create a nice blend of the two genres. On top of those awesome games, Zelda got another entry with Four Swords Adventures, which allowed friends to play together as Link and one of his clones. On a completely different note, Midway dropped what would have been a pretty standard third-person shooter, if it weren't for its epic psychic powers and hilarious ragdoll physics. I don't think I ever beat Psyops, but I had an absolute blast with it regardless. Shooting enemies wasn't my goal, it was always to use each psychic power to its full potential. It sadly never received a follow-up, leaving a niche market untapped until Control came along over a decade later. Continuing on through summer, we got the final NFL game before EA locked down the NFL license and barred the 2K franchise from taking away from Madden's market share. As shitty as that move was, it was a smart decision on their end, because ESPN NFL 2K5 was the best football game released up to that point. The best part? It was $20 compared to Madden's $50. The GameCube was treated well by getting Tales of Symphonia the same month and then Pikmin 2 in August, but there was one massive game that dropped early August. Doom 3 hit shelves 7 years after its last entry on the N64, sporting the best graphics at the time. Doom 3 rebooted the franchise and took the frenetic shooting style the series was known for and slowed it down, opting to lean into a survival horror atmosphere instead. That decision didn't sit well with some Doom fans, however, and the series sat idle again for several more years afterwards. As is tradition, September is where things typically begin to kick off, and it did so by unleashing 10 games upon us. Silent Hill 4 changed the series formula up a bit and gave us probably the scariest entry in the franchise. Pokemon produced the definitive versions of the Kanto region with the release of Fire Red and Leaf Green. One of the most fun multiplayer games of its time also dropped, with Star Wars Battlefront taking away dozens of hours of my life. The Burnout series hit its peak when Burnout 3 Takedown came out and quickly became one of the greatest racing games around. You can love them or hate them, but The Sims got its first official sequel and skyrocketed to become one of the best-selling PC games of all time. And speaking of PC games, Total War got perhaps its best entry when they went to Rome. Sly Cooper also got his first sequel in a criminally underappreciated series. The second game is widely considered the best in a ridiculously fun franchise. Xbox finally received Lionhead's massively hyped Fable, and despite being fun as hell, it was still a bit of a letdown. That's the classic Peter Molyneux experience for you though. September provided another fighting game with the release of Def Jam Fight for New York, which improved on basically everything the first game did. Suplexing Ludacris as Exhibit never felt so good. Lastly, the world was given a wonderfully weird game that came out of nowhere. Katamari Damacy rolled in, asking players to gather objects into a ball until it gets increasingly larger to the point you're rolling up mountains and buildings. It's fucking wild, adorable, charming, and just outright ridiculous. Every game mentioned so far has been a great time, but the final quarter of the year had an insane amount of hype to it because 4 huge games were finally here. The first of them was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas in October. It blew the pants off everyone, rocking a map that was more than double the size of both GTA 3 and Vice City combined. It was massive at the time, and Rockstar was able to fill it with things to do and make it fun to explore. But another game loomed on the horizon that was just as, if not more anticipated than San Andreas. Halo 2 finally hit shelves on November 9th, 2004, to an insane amount of hype. The campaign is a hell of a lot of fun, albeit far too short with that goddamn cliffhanger at the end. But what it did was bring the beloved multiplayer of Combat Evolved to Xbox Live. Its matchmaking service made it incredibly easy for players to match up with opponents and helped bring online gaming to a more casual audience. It also marked a shift in the video game industry, as total video game sales were much closer to box office totals than ever before. But November wasn't done serving up tasty treats, because Metal Gear Solid 3 came out and is considered the best Metal Gear game by a majority of its fans. The introduction of the camouflage system provided a new element to the stealthy gameplay. It had some of the best cutscenes ever seen in games up to that point, and featured a melancholic and memorable final boss fight that lives rent-free in my head. Finally, Half-Life 2 released mid-November and continued the philosophy of the first game by ensuring the player never left the perspective of Gordon Freeman. Its graphics were just as, if not better than Doom 3's, and it contained the most revolutionary physics at the time and made that a primary mechanic. The game was groundbreaking, and its reputation is well-deserved. It's insane we got those 4 games in under a month. If nothing else released for the remainder of the year, this would still rank as a top year. But then the Nintendo DS dropped in November, which went on to be the second best-selling video game device ever. October saw Counter-Strike brought to the Source engine, while Tony Hawk saw his last truly great game release in Underground 2. Then what is considered the best Paper Mario game release on the GameCube as well. I already talked about 3 of the biggest game releases in November, but there's an absolutely massive one I left out. World of Warcraft consumed the lives of millions for years to come and became the biggest MMO ever made. EverQuest 2 released the same month, but nothing could compare to WoW once it got going. But check this out, November had 12 more games that were all really fucking stellar. Need for Speed Underground 2 for racing fans, Metroid Prime got a much anticipated follow-up after it changed the franchise up in a big way. Platforming and action fans ate good, with Ratchet and Clank and Jak getting their 3rd iterations, as well as Prince of Persia and Beautiful Joe getting their sequels. The DS got its own version of Super Mario 64 for anyone wanting to relive that masterpiece in handheld form. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap came out and ranks up there as one of, if not the best handheld Zelda game. If you were a PC gamer and didn't give a crap about World of Warcraft, there were still plenty of options, with the release of Sid Meier's Pirates, Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Finally, Sony got itself another franchise with the first release of Killzone. It's a solid game, but releasing the same month as Halo 2 was a mistake. The year was capped off with an incredible Star Wars RPG when Obsidian came out with Knights of the Old Republic 2. It didn't get the same recognition as the first game, in large part due to LucasArts forcing the devs to rush it, which led to it being unfinished. It's an amazing game and hell of a way to end one of the best years in gaming history.
Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Come on.
We need to skip forward 9 years to find another competitor. The first quarter of the year started things off strong with a reboot of Devil May Cry. Fans loathed the redesign of Dante, but the fast-paced combo-based combat is still fantastic. A week afterwards, a cute little JRPG came out titled Ni no Kuni: Wrath of the White Witch. It's a gorgeous game in large part due to the collaboration with Studio Ghibli. If DMC wasn't for you, thankfully you didn't have to wait long for another action game to come along. Metal Gear Rising was developed in conjunction with Platinum Games, who crush ass when it comes to action games. The result is players taking control of a cyborg Raiden and using his katana to hack away at enemies. The DS got possibly its best game of the year early on when Fire Emblem Awakening made its way to the West. Credited for saving the franchise after it endured a major slump in sales during the 2000s and was on the verge of being shelved. Awakening revitalized the series and gave fans perhaps the best iteration in the franchise. The following month, the DS got a follow-up to a game that seemed forgotten by Nintendo. Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon came out and scratched that ghost hunting itch, although it didn't quite hit the same level that its predecessor did. Like Fire Emblem, Lara Croft was revitalized with a reboot in March of 2013. It borrowed aspects of the Uncharted series, which was a fantastic decision because the game is a hell of a lot of fun and continued the legacy of a classic gaming character. The quarter finished off with a bang when it took us to the Sky City of Columbia. BioShock Infinite had a totally different vibe than BioShock 1 and 2, but it pulled off telling another incredible story in a beautiful setting and went on to be considered one of the best games of the year. The second quarter of 2013 began with a trio of unconventional games. Injustice is a fighter featuring DC characters created by the folks behind the modern Mortal Kombat games. Far Cry received an absolutely wacky-ass offshoot with Blood Dragon, and the Metroidvania genre got a worthy addition with the first Guacamelee game. May was a bit slower with one noteworthy title coming out. Metro Last Light expanded on the Metro series, continuing the tense gameplay of the first and maintained some of the best atmospheres seen in first-person shooters. Speaking of bleak and oppressive atmospheres, Animal Crossing New Leaf came out so Tom Nook can bleed your pockets dry yet again. The real star of the quarter and the year hit the PlayStation 3 June 14th. The Last of Us is an amazing game that fires on all cylinders. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I think just about every part of it is perfect. I love how it mixes stealth and combat and gives the player the choice to approach situations how they see fit. However, the aspect that sets it apart from everything else is its story and characters. Not just Joel and Ellie either, but all the side characters are believable people just trying to survive in a well-crafted and terrifying apocalyptic world. The remainder of summer had its fair share of worthy games to get into as well. Gran Turismo, Pikmin, Rayman, Saints Row, and Splinter Cell all got new entries. A couple indie titles dropped that were very different from each other. Gone Home received the notorious walking simulator title, but uncovering the mystery of the empty house is incredibly interesting and well worth the effort. The other one is Papers, Please, which seems simple on the surface as the player is tasked with checking documents and granting entry to immigrants who have the correct paperwork. But as you continue to do your job, you're faced with making choices that can lead to 20 different endings. The next game isn't an indie game like the other two, although it certainly comes across as one. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons puts us in control of two characters at the same time, with one assigned to the left thumbstick and the other assigned to the right. It received critical acclaim for combining elements of a strong fantasy world with aspects of the incredible 2012 game Journey. Lastly, a couple massive time sinks released in July and August. Valve's Dota 2 came out on PC and quickly became one of the top esports titles around, and still to this day dominates events. The next title is an expansion, but what it did to Final Fantasy XIV cannot be understated. A Realm Reborn changed the MMO entirely and set it down a path to become the only real competitor for World of Warcraft. Now we're in September, and whenever one of these games releases, God help anything else that tries to release anywhere near it. Grand Theft Auto 5 exploded onto the scene September 17th and within 3 days hit $1 billion in sales, cementing it as the fastest selling entertainment product in history. Its insane amount of sales was well earned as the game perfected the GTA formula with a massive map and 3 memorable protagonists to play as. 2 weeks later, Rockstar opened up GTA Online and hasn't looked back since. The game was so successful, it's been re-released a million fucking times on anything you can think of and continues to print money. Even with the release of GTA, the year had plenty left to offer. Assassin's Creed Black Flag pumped a breath of fresh air into the series by sailing the Caribbean, while Telltale Games released a follow-up to the outstanding Walking Dead with their downloadable episode 400 Days, and then several months later began their next venture by releasing The Wolf Among Us. Battlefield, the Arkham series, and Pokemon all got new releases in October alongside a couple story-heavy titles in the Stanley Parable and Beyond Two Souls. 2013 was a year where Microsoft and Sony went head-to-head yet again with a couple of brand new consoles. It's always exciting when a new console releases upon us, but man, do the launches of the PS4 and Xbox One kinda suck. Xbox barely had any exclusives worth playing, except Dead Rising 3 and Rise, which were alright. Sony clearly won the battle here because they had Knack, baby! I take it all back about the PS4 launch lacking because Knack is the video game of all time, and we're all lucky to have experienced this masterpiece in gaming. It makes any subsequent games inconsequential. Who needs to play Super Mario 3D World? Nobody bought the Wii U anyway. A Link Between Worlds? Actually, yeah, that game is fire. And that caps off 2013. The year ruled, and the next one is even better because Knack 2 busted its nuts on the gaming world September 5th of 2017. We don't need anything else. In all seriousness, 2017's opening quarter might just be the strongest first 3 months of any year. It began with the sequel to Gravity Rush that continued the awesome gravity-based mechanics the first one started. It's a series I barely see get talked about, but considering the release window they chose, it's perfectly understandable why it flew under the radar. And that's because Resident Evil Dawn dominated the month of January despite coming out near the end of the month. After the mess that was Resident Evil 6, Capcom shifted its approach towards their flagship franchise. Resident Evil 7 marked the first mainline game that's played in the first-person perspective, which lent to the horrifying and claustrophobic feeling of the game. It's one of the best in the series and amongst the scariest games ever made. February was a particularly good month that began with one of the strongest Souls-like games in Team Ninja's Neo. A week later, For Honor came out, and while there's single player, the game took off due to its multiplayer. Another week later, the RTS genre got a fantastic entry with Halo Wars 2. The end of the month was absolutely loaded though, because Hollow Knight became an instant classic and is perhaps the best Metroidvania games out there due to its art style, combat, satisfying difficulty, and awesome boss fights. Then to close out the month, PlayStation got yet another massive franchise when Horizon Zero Dawn came out. Slowly uncovering the secrets of the world while fighting robot dinosaurs was just a ton of fun. This would have been my personal game of the year if it wasn't for another open world game that came out the following month. March was important because Nintendo came out swinging when it released their new console. The Switch was both a home console and a portable one, and the way it implemented them is seamless. It's been over 6 years since its release, and that thing still sells like crazy. It caught on quickly in large part due to what just might be the best launch game of all time in Breath of the Wild. The feeling Breath of the Wild provides is just unmatched. I felt at peace running everywhere, climbing everything, eating great and shitty food alike, and doing anything at my own leisure. Another game released in March that's quite unique. The Nier series didn't really take off until the release of Automata. It's yet another Platinum Games classic that blends different genres into a strange but incredibly fun package. Following that up is another great month as the worldwide release of Persona 5 happened early in April, which gave players a few weeks to focus on that until the final week of the month slammed us with Outlast 2, another superb walking simulator in What Remains of Edith Finch, the first Little Nightmares, and the definitive version of Mario Kart 8 that is by far the best-selling Switch game to date. The Switch's first year on the market was honestly absurd. On top of Zelda and Mario Kart, the console got a follow-up to Splatoon in July. It took everything the first game established and made it better. The only drawback is that Nintendo continues to prove they have no fucking clue how to copy Microsoft and Sony's online capabilities, which ultimately limited Splatoon 2 a bit. The following month, Ubisoft teamed up with Nintendo and created a game that nobody expected to be any good. Combining Mario with the world of Rabbids and an XCOM-like experience sounded stupid as hell, but goddamn does it work. It's a great game in solo and co-op, and not one I expected to sink so much time into. Early Switch adopters were not only treated to a top-tier Zelda game, but also got Super Mario Odyssey on October 27th. Mario has a long history with a ton of games to compete for the top spot, and while Odyssey may not be the best one, it's easily top 5. Lastly, near the end of the year, the Switch got another exclusive when Xenoblade Chronicles 2 dropped, giving the console an epic and time-consuming RPG to ring in the new year. Looking back, the Switch might have had the best opening year to a console ever. Let's bounce back to May when Arcane released an absolutely underrated game dripping with atmosphere. Prey came out, and despite both Dishonored games putting Arcane in the limelight, nobody seemed to care much about Prey. It saw low sales but reviewed really well and went down as one of the best games of 2017. A week after its release, NetherRealm came out with their follow-up to Injustice, which wound up being a bigger and better version of the first iteration. The following month saw the launch of Game Pass, which is notable because it changed the way Microsoft approached its strategy with game releases. June also provided a welcome return of Crash Bandicoot. The original 3 games were remade perfectly and brought a wave of nostalgia back to those that grew up playing them. Right in the dead of summer, one game was released and nobody could have predicted the juggernaut it would become. Fortnite hit early access in July and breached 1 million players about a month later. However, it didn't fully hit its stride until the Battle Royale game mode launched in September. Multiplayer games had a strong outing in the last half of the year actually, with Destiny 2 launching in September with some extremely satisfying gunplay. 2 months later, EA's infamous launch of Battlefront 2 took place. To say they botched it initially is an understatement, but after the wave of negative feedback, they were able to right the ship and make Battlefront 2 a really enjoyable experience. Then in December, on the heels of Fortnite, entered another major contender in the Battle Royale genre, PUBG completely took over for a few months, but it wasn't long until Fortnite was crowned king. If you're like me, you're not a big multiplayer gamer, so luckily there were plenty of good single-player experiences to end the year. August gave us the best Sonic game in years when Sonic Mania came during the character's 25th anniversary. Another Uncharted game hit the PS4, but due to the absence of Nathan Drake, it didn't get the same recognition as the mainline games, but it's an awesome experience nonetheless. Hellblade also released that month and gave players a chance to walk in the shoes of a character struggling with psychosis. Its realistic depiction of Senua's condition is what sets it apart and makes it a truly unique experience. Going through the final months, Cuphead came out of nowhere, despite it being announced 4 years prior to its actual release. It was instantly popular, selling a couple million copies during its timed exclusive deal with Microsoft. Larian Studio also dropped their follow-up to the Divinity series. Not even considering Mario, October was a solid month for gamers because we got South Park: The Fractured But Whole, which was essentially playing an extended episode of the TV show and is a must-play for fans. Assassin's Creed received a makeover when Origins came out, allowing assassins to roam the Sahara in a massive open world. Shooter fans were treated to another Wolfenstein game, and even though it wasn't quite as good as The New Order, Colossus was still good fun. And lastly, The Evil Within got an unexpected sequel and changed the series up quite a bit. And that's it. Those are what I believe to be the 5 best years in games before this one. So now let's see what all came out in 2023 and verify if it's able to usurp any of these to be in the top 5. It took about 3 weeks for the year to get a worthy game that makes this list. Fire Emblem Engage came out on the Switch on January 20th, then within the span of a week, Hi-Fi Rush was shadow dropped, rocking a gorgeous art style that pairs perfectly with the rhythm-based gameplay. Pizza Tower followed that up by coming out just a day later and is absolutely one of the best indie games of the year. Then to close out the month, that fantastic Dead Space remake release and brought one of my all-time favorite horror franchises back from the dead. February continued the gangbang of dope games and started off with a somewhat controversial title that went on to become a top seller in the year. Hogwarts Legacy successfully fulfilled the dreams of Potterheads by dropping players into a fully explorable version of the famous wizarding school. Next up is Atomic Heart, and while it received mixed reactions, you could feel the BioShock inspiration throughout, and the core of a great concept that was oh so close to being great. Right after that, Nintendo brought one of its all-timers to the Switch, and gave the graphics and control scheme an overhaul to bring Metroid Prime up to modern standards. February closed out with the Octopath Traveler sequel that seems to have flown under the radar. I wasn't the biggest fan of the first, but the second one deserves some recognition for the improvements it made. March kicked off with another Souls-like developed by Team Ninja. Wo Long is a more approachable version of Nioh, but still presents a challenge for those that want it. Bayonetta got a new game that is way different from her other titles. With one of the most gorgeous art styles of the year, Origins has a similar playstyle to Brothers, and serves as a prequel to the series. The final week of the month was dominated by one game. But before I feature that, I want to bring up another great indie title with Dredge, as well as the other amazing indie games we got in general, highlighted by My Friendly Neighborhood, Cocoon, Bramble the Mountain King, and Killer Frequency. But then Resident Evil 4 came out, and that's all anyone could talk about at the time. Capcom continues their ongoing efforts to update their older games in their most popular franchise. Resident Evil 4 was a huge risk because the original is so beloved, but man, they killed it. They succeeded in updating the gameplay and environments while keeping the same action movie vibe of the original, resulting in one of the best video game remakes ever. We also got the Separate Ways DLC a few months later to give us an excuse to dive back in. 2023 saw a lot of remakes and remasters in general. Advance Wars 1 and 2 were delayed an entire year and brought the same strategic gameplay from the Game Boy to a modern audience. Nintendo was on a roll because they did the same with the first 2 Pikmin games, so now the entire franchise can be experienced on the Switch with the release of Pikmin 4 in July. They also worked to revive an unexpected classic with a Super Mario RPG remake receiving 3D visuals and gameplay updates. Lastly, the final remake of the year dropped in May and almost seemed like it would never come out. So once it finally released, it was a surprise to many. System Shock brought the unsettling classic from 1994 to the present in a largely faithful remake of the original. Now as we get into April, this is when 2023 really started to pick up. Dead Island got a long-awaited follow-up after years of development hell. When it finally came came out, fans were pleasantly surprised because the game was actually good. Nothing mind-blowing, but considering what it went through, it's a small miracle the game ended up as polished as it was. Another game that dropped in April wasn't so polished, especially on PC, but Star Wars Jedi Survivor on consoles was a much smoother experience. What we got was an awesome follow-up to Fallen Order that fixed a lot of the complaints from the first game. The combat was improved and the environments are even more intricate and fun to explore. It's the ultimate Star Wars experience for gamers, and I can't wait to see what Respawn does with their third title. May was reserved for one massive game everybody was anticipating. Tears of the Kingdom immediately became a Game of the Year contender by providing everything that Breath of the Wild did, but on a much larger and more customizable scale. The physics engine of Breath of the Wild allowed quite a bit of creativity, so Nintendo saw what players were doing and made tools to allow us to do even more. It made Breath of the Wild seem like a tech demo in comparison, and it's wild they were able to make it run so smoothly on the Switch. The only way to follow that up is to give us the second strongest month in the entire year. Street Fighter 6 is the most accessible fighting game ever made. Blizzard launched their fourth entry in the Diablo franchise, which was a success all around. However, their post-launch fuckery did kinda tarnish it a bit. Amnesia sent horror fans to the bunker with their fourth iteration as well and continued the butthole-puckering, stress-inducing gameplay the series is known for. The next game is a hodgepodge of genres that are blended perfectly into a fun and relaxing game known as Dave the Diver. It's on many people's Game of the Year list for good reason. Finally, one of my personal games of the year was released and marked the first time Final Fantasy was rated M. It absolutely fucks and includes some of the most epic boss fights in video game history. Plus, the music on its own is award-worthy. July felt like a breather month for the flurry of releases June gave us, but in a great year of games, even breather months have something to provide. Remnant 2 dropped and was another solid entry in the Souls-like genre, which saw a decent amount of success in 2023 with another 2 titles. Lords of the Fallen was one of the many games to drop in October and has been plagued with performance issues. Underneath those is a pretty decent game though. However, what is the best Souls-like not made by FromSoft themselves puts the players into the shoes of Pinocchio as he battles against other puppets. This is a must-play for fans of the genre. Speaking of FromSoft, their long-dormant mecha series came back to life in August when Armored Core 6 launched. After the massive success of their Soulsborne games, they went back to their roots and gave old fans something they've been waiting for. If that isn't your cup of tea, maybe a couple different RPGs are more your speed. Sea of Stars is a love letter to the classic days of JRPGs like Chrono Trigger. If you're not into those, then maybe the full release of Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 is. What they accomplish with the game is just plain ridiculous. How much the story varies based on players' decisions means the chances of one person having the same experience than another is next to impossible. It raised the bar so high, other studios immediately began damage control by trying to tell the public that it should not be the new standard. Next up in September, Cyberpunk got an overhaul with the release of the Phantom Liberty DLC, which capped off a respectable mission by CD Projekt Red to rectify their mistakes with the launch of Cyberpunk. Bethesda finally released a new IP with the launch of Starfield, which was polarizing to say the least. That's in large part due to how long it took to develop, the hype Todd Howard fed into when discussing it, and the fact that Xbox lacks in big AAA exclusives. Mid-September gifted us the next Mortal Kombat game and made things extra confusing by putting the number 1 after the title. It's a reboot and a sequel all at once, but what's important is the game itself, and the fighting is as fun and as polished as ever. Earlier, I mentioned June as the second best month this year, and that's because October handily takes the crown as the best month. Starting with the smaller games, Cities Skylines 2 dropped near the end of the month, Ghost Runner 2 released 2 days later, and Sonic Superstars gave fans another classic 2D adventure. However, these days Sonic is unable to compete with Mario when he's called up to bat. Super Mario Wonder returned the plumber to the world of 2D and quickly shot up into people's Game of the Year lists, and is also being hailed as one of the very best 2D Mario games. A title that felt like it got lost in the onslaught of October releases was the new iteration in the Forza Motorsport franchise that elected to pull a Mortal Kombat and confuse people with the title by doing away with conventional numbering. The other big 3 games of the month begin with a return to what made Assassin's Creed so popular. Mirage was a tighter and more focused game and removed a ton of the bloat the recent releases contained. Next is Insomniac's hugely anticipated Spider-Man 2, which took everything they learned from the previous games and rolled it into an awesome spectacle. I consider it the best superhero game ever made because of how it juggles its 3 heroes and one of Spidey's most iconic villains. It's proof that Insomniac is an S-tier developer that very few can outperform. The final game of October is another game of the year for me. Remedy's return to Alan Wake came in the form of a much different game than his first outing. They go full-on survival horror with it and tell a fascinating and strange story. It's the best looking game I've seen so far and includes what might be the most memorable sections of the year.
It was all too much, I had to get away.
This is a must play for fans of survival horror. The year isn't quite over, so there's still a chance for more great games to come out, and as of recording, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is reviewing quite well. And that wraps things up. What year do you think is the best we've ever seen? Is there one I didn't mention in this video you think I completely missed? Let me know how wrong or right you think I am so we can argue about it in the comments. With 2023 nearly done, it's definitely one of the best years we've seen and gamers have been spoiled. But I don't think it's the best year we've seen. My final rankings go like this. Getting knocked out of my top 5 is 2013. Sure, it contains one of my favorite games ever and the biggest game of all time, but the overall quality doesn't match the others. Plus, the launches of the Xbox One and PS4 were pretty disappointing. 2017 is 5th on my list and gets carried heavily by the launch of the Nintendo Switch. It had a fantastic first year, but we also saw the launch of Game Pass, Resident Evil Revitalized, a new awesome Sony franchise, a nostalgia trip, and the massive success of Fortnite. 2001 is next up. It was the year we saw the death of Sega and the rise of Microsoft. The GameCube is also a great console that didn't get enough love at the time. There were some truly groundbreaking games that came out that continue to influence the industry today. In third place is 2023. The insane amount of quality games this year left fans of any genre with something to enjoy, and it made it so difficult to keep up with. I hope 2024 calms the fuck down, to be honest. In what might be a controversial decision, 1998 is taking second. There's a lot of nostalgia for me this year. Some of my earliest memories are playing video games, but 98 is when I really think the hobby took hold of me, and that's due to the amount of great games to choose from. My final spot is admittedly another year filled with nostalgia, but 2004 deserves the top spot not just due to volume, but due to quality. There are plenty of years with perfectly fine games that come out, but from start to finish, 2004 gave us banger after banger after banger. Maybe the impact it had on the industry wasn't quite as big as 98 or 2001, but from a gamer's perspective, there were some tough choices to make between what games you were going to prioritize, because there simply wasn't enough time to get to everything. Consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel if you like video game deep dives like this. Maybe check out my kill count videos as well for something a little different. I'm King Deshane, signing off for now.